Today I want to talk about 9 different lessons we can learn from agriculture, homesteading, country living during war times. Hey everybody, Chad Cruiser here with Health and Homestead. The first one I want to talk about is a little history lesson about back during World War I. You see, during World War I, the United States began to realize that they were going to have to ramp up their agricultural system to be able to support the conflict that was taking place in Europe. And so the farmers were having to produce much more. And so what they did, and they were encouraged to get the best tractors and implements and things they could get for growing more food. And so that's what many of them did, and it was just fantastic. They were making all kinds of extra money. This was phenomenal. The trouble is the war ended. Well, actually, that's wonderful for most people, but for the farmers, this brought about a depression in the agricultural market. And so you can imagine the old saying, he lost the farm, right? And so one of the first things to learn is that it may seem like, oh, it's a great thing to, get some additional debt right now, but that may actually be detrimental at the conclusion of the matter. Now, number 2 has to do with the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. You might have heard about it. It's there in Norway, actually above Norway, between Norway and the North Pole. They have this underground seed vault. They also call it like the Doomsday Seed Vault, where countries all around planet Earth have been sending seed and they put them underground, and this thing supposedly could go for hundreds of years without any human intervention, and the seeds many of them would stay viable underground there. Well, up until this point, humans have just been putting seeds in, and actually it was back in 2015 was the first time that seeds were taken back out to plant again, and that was because of what was going on in Syria. You had the civil war taking place in Syria, and Aleppo, where they had a seed vault or a place where people would get seeds, because of the war, people were not able to access them anymore, and as a result, they had to go get those seeds, and so they sent like a third of them back to Syria so that the people can plant again or could plant again. Now, the point here to learn is that war can cause problems in the agricultural market, specifically in seed distribution. And that's one of the reasons, not only for wartime, but I would say for any of us, whether we're a home gardener, a market gardener, a homesteader, or a large farmer, one of the things that is phenomenal to learn is how to save your own seeds so that in difficult times, you would still have them. Number 3 has to do with something that's taking place right now. It's very interesting that in Ukraine, from what I've read, for like 20 years or so, they have not allowed farmers to sell their farmland in Ukraine. And right now during the war, they decided they'll open it up to allow farmers to sell. Now, okay, that could be beneficial, but think about it. How difficult is that? Who wants to buy farmland right now? And the people who do are probably going to be large, agribusiness farms who can buy up the farmland, and they're probably going to be buying it at fire sale prices. And so this is actually very difficult for these farmers. And hey, if they want to get out, I totally get it. But the difficulty is, you can also understand, in difficult times, if war is in your country, it can cause a lot of trouble. You may have to sell, and sadly, you might have to sell at a loss. I don't know what to make of that point. It's just not a pretty one. Number 4 has to do with what's taking place right now. You've probably heard that Russia is one of the largest producers of fertilizer on planet Earth, and much of that fertilizer isn't going to other parts of the world right now. And as a result, in places like the United States, some of the fertilizer is upwards of 300% more expensive than it was just a year ago. And so, not always, but some of it is. And so the point being, this makes it significantly more expensive for the farmer to buy it. Now, he's going to pass on that price increase to the one he sells it to, and ultimately that comes down to the consumer. For people in wealthy countries, wealthy people at least, it's not going to make as big of a difference. But for poor people, and especially people in like third world countries, this can break the bank. And so this is something to consider. If you're not a large scale farmer, you could do things like having your own animals that you use their manure, or you could be using large amounts of compost so that you could actually fertilize your own property with as little outside input as possible. Number 5, we've already alluded to that during wartime, it can be more difficult to access food, and because of that, growing your own food can be extremely important. I've read book after book about people's experiences during wartime, and many of them have to grow their own food, you can imagine, during war. And being able to do that is much more difficult in the city. Now, even in the city, you may be able to, if you don't even have a backyard, you can talk to some folks. Maybe there's some elderly people, and you say, hey, listen, I don't have my own land, but could I use your backyard, and I will give you some of the produce, and I will take some for myself and maybe to sell. That's one thing you could do. But for those of us who have land in the country, growing your own food can help you and your family have much more food security. Number 6 is another lesson from history. Back during the beginning of World War II, England was importing about 2/3 of all of the food that it needed for its people. And the trouble is that at the beginning of the war, these German U-boats, the old submarines, were out there, and they were making it more difficult to bring that food into the country. And so they had to get their farmers, once again, as many countries have to do during wartime, to really increase their production. And so that's another thing to think about, that supply lines may become more difficult. Even transporting food can become more difficult during wartime. Number 7 is strangely a benefit often to farmers in wartime, and that is that their food is needed much more. And so prices of food can sometimes actually go up exponentially. And so this can be a benefit to farmers. Now, I don't at all suggest that you, try to really stick it to people with prices. You want to be as competitive as possible while also helping your family out. But that is one benefit of being able to do agriculture. Even if you're just you could have even a small plot, but really be able to make a decent living during these difficult times. A little anecdotal story back from Europe during World War II. My wife and I were reading about this family that were living in Germany. They were against the war, but they lived there, and so they were raising their own provisions. They lived out in the country, and just a little thought that the people in the city, they had to take rations from the government, and it was hardly enough to survive of. You can imagine, especially toward the end of the war when Germany was losing the battle, and this family, they were able to have plenty of food, but they had made it illegal to bring food into the people in the cities. Other than the provisions they were given from the government, you couldn't just bring to your cousins or your uncle and aunt in the city and just give them some food. They made it illegal, and you may lose your life for doing it. And this family in the book, they would take their 12-year-old son, and he would go in with a sack of food on his back. They figured, well, maybe they're less likely to take out a child and kill a child for doing this. And so he was able to go back and to help out his family in the city. But, there are difficult times, and once again, often during those times, it's just simply better and safer, not always, but it's often safer in the country. Number 8 has to do with actually the Napoleonic Wars. You may remember that Napoleon was basically trying to take over Europe. As this was happening, one of the struggles back then especially was to get enough food to your soldiers. And back then they only had basically dehydration or, drying out foods, but there just wasn't a lot of options back then, or using things like grains and so forth. But Napoleon asked, he said he would give a bunch of money to whoever would come up with a new method of preserving food. And there was a man by the name of Nicholas Appert who ended up being the man who came up with the idea for canning. Actually, we didn't really have it before the 1700s or early 1800s. So Nicholas Appert came up with the idea. He was awarded the money. As a result, today we have the benefit of being able to use canning. And so one of the things during difficult times that is beneficial to just about anybody is to be able to preserve their own food. Obviously, we do have dehydration. We have some foods that preserve themselves very well on their own, but then we also have things like canning. So learning to preserve your own food is very beneficial to you. Number 9 is quite fascinating. I've looked at government documents and also read stories about foods that have been shown to be beneficial during wartime, foods specifically to grow. And 2 of the very simple ones, number 1, a very popular one today, is potatoes. Potatoes are something they grow in the ground because they've found historically, now most wars today are not going to have thousands of soldiers marching over your property like you had through much of Earth's history where they just decimate your whole farm and field. But just looking back historically anyway, what they found is that things that you had growing up on the ground like corn and so forth, they would just be taken out. They would be gone as the soldiers would go through largely. But they found that the underground foods like tubers or potatoes and so forth, that these things were more likely to be safe. Sure, they may take some on their way, and so you lose, a significant amount of them, but not nearly as much as if you have things above ground. Now, obviously having things above ground is very important, but during wartime it's something to think about, and they're good to have any other time because things like potatoes are one of the highest yielding foods of all plants there are, and so you get the most calories and nutrition per acre and protein from potatoes compared to almost anything else, and way more than you would get from any animal product. And so potatoes are number one great. Another one that the United States government has historically talked about that you may never have had, I have grown them, and I have them on my property now, are something called Jerusalem artichokes. They're not artichokes, they're not from Jerusalem. I have tons of information about these things, and I'll probably do some more things in the future on these, but these are also one of the highest yielding plants, and most people wouldn't know what they are. So even if they saw these plants, these sunflower type plants growing on your property, you don't eat the sunflower on these, you actually eat the tuber. Having these are another plant that back during war in Europe, all the way back to the 1600s, this was a plant that actually saved people in an area of Germany called Thuringia. And so our government has said during times of war, having Jerusalem artichokes is one of the most important food sources. I'll tell you, they're not my favorite food, and they can really give you some gas, but they could really help you out having food in difficult times. So just two different foods that you may consider during difficult times. If you haven't seen some of our videos on natural remedies that have been proven by science, check this one out here. Absolutely phenomenal. God bless and have a fantastic day.